We are now a week removed from one of the greatest weeks and few weeks of random sports of all time. Obviously, if you're with me, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm speaking of this intense 2-week period known as the Olympics. I loved the Olympics. I love watching them. And for some of you, you could not wait for all the hype to be over, for all of the channels that maybe you enjoy watching on a normal basis. You just couldn't wait for those to be free. You couldn't wait for all this to be done. But if you're like me, you've been having withdrawals this week, trying to figure out, man, what do I watch? Like, what do I see on TV now? There's no more badminton or handball on, so what am I gonna do? If you're like me and you've had these withdrawals, raise your hand. If you're thankful that all of this Olympic stuff is over, raise your hand. All right, so here's the cool thing though, is I expected a pretty fine line. So that's cool, because here's the thing is I've learned that you either love the Olympics or you probably hate them. There's some indifference in there, but for the most part, I didn't realize until this year how much I adored the Olympics. And so I just want to give you a snippet of what it's like watching the Olympics with me. That's a live look into my house. I'm that guy when I watch the Olympics. If you're like that, raise your hand. I mean, it doesn't matter what sport it is. If America's on, I'm like, America, let's go. And I get so hyped about the most random things. I mean, I found myself watching competitive shooting, skeet shooting. I didn't even know, I've watched that before, but I found myself just entrenched in it. I watched track and field. I enjoyed that. 400 relays, all these different things. I was just invested in it because I'm that guy who I watch and America's got to come out on top. And it could be something that we're awful at. I watch badminton and I'm like, surely we're not going to win any of this. But I still watch and I was like, man, maybe, just maybe, America can win this. And so I'm that guy when I watch it. But here's the deal. Here's why I love the Olympics. You never know what obscure sport that you're missing until the Olympics is on. You don't realize how many of the sports that you're just missing out on. And you may be like, well, I'm not missing out on any of these. No, you are, I promise. If you watch the Olympics, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I found myself watching so many of these random sports that I never even thought about watching before. And even better than that, I found by the end of the week, I was even coaching them on how they should do what they do. I'd been listening to these commentators and on the dives, I'm like, forgot to thrust the hips forward. The legs came forward. That's what the issue was. They shouldn't have done that. And I remember watching wrestling and I was like, drop the hips, you gotta he didn't drop the hips. And I kid you not, up until this week, I had absolutely no idea about scoring of wrestling. Now I know wrestling isn't that obscure of a sport, but it's just something that I've never really been around. And I found by the end of the week, I actually knew all the point system, and I'm telling you, I was coaching every bit of that mess. I was like, this is what you should be doing. You should be doing this. So I love doing that. I watch some fencing, wrestling, handball. I watch BMX, triathlons, biathlons, track and field, men's volleyball, and I even watch the best sport to come to Olympics. Can anyone guess what that is? Any guess? What? Basketball? That's very close. Interpretive dance. I watched a little bit of that. It was... I watched the objects one where they were throwing hula hoops, and it was different. I couldn't watch too much of that. I got bored, I'm gonna be honest with you. The best sport to ever hit Olympic scenes, Olympic race walking. Oh man, if you have ever watched Olympic race walking, it will blow your mind. And I kid you not, I tried to enter into a competition when I was in college in Olympic race walking. And you may be like, that's a joke, and I'm dead serious. I even had an agent. My best friend, he was my agent, and he called this guy and was like, hey, I've got a new up-and-coming racer, and he wants to get on the scene. Let's get him invited, and let's get him involved. And this guy literally called him and was like, man, we have signed Boshman Unchurch up for the race in Houston on this date. We want him to be here, and we're excited about him. And I was like, yeah. And I was going to be an Olympic race walker, but then here was the issue, is how that competition worked is they had all these different races, and you had to do the smallest and you had to do the longest. And then you could pick one in between those that you didn't have to do. Well, me being me, I was thinking, well, of course, the one that I don't want to do is the longest, because you had to do 500 meters, and then you had to do a mile and then 2 miles, and then they'd have a 5 mile. And I was like, well, of course, the one I don't want to do is the 5 mile, because I'm quick on my race walking, but I have no longevity. So I was like, let's just do all these. But then that was part of the rules is you have to do the shortest, you have to do the longest. I was like, man, I'm going to get beat by people like 8 times my age, so I can't do this. And so I bowed out. I was like, I can't do this. I'm not in the training shape that I need to be in. So I bailed. But I kid you not, watching Olympic race walking is one of the greatest things. It's very chicken-esque. If you want to get it, there's a lot of hip movement. It's fantastic. I encourage you to YouTube Olympic race walking if you've never seen it. And I must admit, I have very good form in this. And so if you need coaching, if you want to get into the world of Olympic race walking, hit me up. I would love to show you this. But here's the thing: is I watch all these events. I was amazed at how much time these people and these athletes put into their craft. I was amazed to find out how long they had poured into practice, how long that they had sought after training. And some of these athletes, they spent upwards of about 10 hours a day. And this was 6 days a week just to practice. And while listening to the radio, I found this is that swimmer Katie Ledecky, she was talking about it, and she said, look, I swim somewhere around 6,000 to 8,000 meters in a good practice. And she said, and for me, and just so you know, 6,000 to 8,000 meters is roughly 3.5 to 5 miles. But she said this, she said, I do this in a good practice, and get this, I practice around 9 times a week in any given week. That is nuts. That's a ton of effort. That's a ton of sweat and exertion for this craft. I mean, these athletes spend all sorts of time, regardless of what sport, from table tennis to triathlons, from badminton to basketball, from rowing to rugby. They all devoted themselves. They devoted their lives to training and preparing for action. They prepared themselves for these races and for these events. Year-round, they're consumed with getting physically and mentally into shape. And it's for this purpose. It's just to achieve the reward of a lifetime. A moment in the limelight and a piece of precious metal. They pursue all this for a moment of limelight and just a piece of precious metal. But despite how impressive the historic moment or how long the Olympic record has stood, I want us to understand something, that these legacies, they never outlast the test of time. These legacies soon fail, each and every one of them. No matter how long or how remarkable, they all eventually come to an end. We hear every Olympic season how this record has now come to an end by this person, and it's set this unprecedented record. And then, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, then again, those records, they never stand. Those recognitions, all those things eventually fall. What we learn is they're perishable. Therefore, this morning, what I want to discuss is the pursuit of the imperishable. And the focal point of our text this morning is going to be on 1 Corinthians 9, verses 24 through 27. And we'll get there in just a little bit. But what I want to do this morning is I want to approach this topic completely backwards. I like to do stuff flipped upside down sometimes. And so this morning, we're going to approach this completely backwards. And so if you're with me on doing stuff backwards, say amen. Amen. Good. How many of you, it stresses you out, even the thought of doing something backwards? Good. I'll be honest, it normally would me too. But I'm very logistic in my thinking, and this just made sense to me. So we're going to do this completely backwards. And so what we're going to do is I want us to look at this idea of Olympics, of races, of events. And what I want us to do is I want us to first look at the finish line. I want us to first take a good examination of our goal, of our finish line. So how many of in here have ever raced in an actual race? Sanctioned, not just you and your friends racing. All right, how many of you have actually won that race? Okay. I never won any races in my life. Let's just be honest. I'm not fast. Mom, dad, brother, they're all track stars. And then there's me. And so this idea of racing was never a part of my system. I played sports that I could not race. Basketball, I would stand in corners. Baseball, I was a pitcher and a first baseman. Running is not my forte. But here's what I do know, is that in all of these races, what did you always seek to do? You seek to finish, first and foremost. But more importantly, you sought to hit the finish line first. And here's what I know is that in all these things, what we got to understand is each time you race, there is always an easy and identifiable finish line. There's always a goal, because it's imperative before ever starting and setting foot in a race that we must first identify the goal. We got to identify what that finish line is, because the reality of it is that the finish line is our motivation. It's our purpose. It's our goal. It's what we want to achieve. And so this morning, before we get started, I want us, as we examine this idea and this imagery of this race and this event, I want us to first put our foots and put our eyes on the finish line. So that's what I mean by we're going to start backwards. Rather than starting at the beginning, at the starting point, we're going to start at the finish line so we can see and achieve what we're purposed for, what we're made for. And so I want to do this by looking at Hebrews 12. So if you have a Bible this morning, you want to join me in Hebrews 12. There's just 2 verses we're going to look at really quick as we get started. But it begins and it says, therefore we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. So the writer, often thought to be Paul here, says that we are surrounded by these cloud of witnesses. And we preached through this not too long ago. And just for a refresher though, this cloud of witnesses that it refers to, it's all these giants of the faith that are mentioned in chapter 11. Chapter 11 of Hebrews is known as the faith chapter. And in it, he just goes off and he says, by faith, this person did this person. And he gives all these Old Testament saints and Old Testament heroes. It says these people did all these incredible things by faith. And so now we're in chapter 12 and he said, we are surrounded by this cloud of witnesses. And these witnesses are all those people of faith who did miraculous things for the kingdom, but also it's countless others of God's faithful who had also finished their race. And the writer says, because we are surrounded by these faithful ones and they finished the race, he says this also. He says, let us also lay aside each weight, every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Now there's a reason we want to start here this morning is because this passage, it gives us our finish line. Now it's important to see the bigger metaphor and the bigger picture being presented here. The picture that's being presented here is this race, this event. And as it says this, it says, look, that we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. And as we get closer to the finish line, let us lay aside these weights that cling to us, that hold us down. And the idea here is that runners would run in kind of like the ending of a biathlon or a triathlon. They would run into this arena, and that would be the final leg of the race. And as they would step foot in the arena, the first thing they would look up is they would see tiers upon tiers of witnesses, cheering them on, chanting their name, encouraging them and saying, finish, you're strong, you get there, get to the finish line. And so that's the first thing we see is when we're looking at this imagery, the author notes that we are surrounded by these cloud of witnesses as we run towards the finish line, as we get into the arena towards the end of our race. We have witnesses, faithful ones of God, all the ones that are in chapter 11, but also many more that are going to be building us up, that are going to be cheering us on. And notice how it says this. It says these witnesses, they're not just spectators. They're not just watching. They are those who are faithfully set before God and ran the race. And so sticking with this imagery, notice it says, let us lay aside every weight. We just spoke of this, but sin, it clings closely to us. So the idea here is these weights of sin, push them to the side, let them go. And runners, what they would do is they would shed all unnecessary weight that they didn't need to make it to the finish line. They'd get rid of everything so they could better achieve the finish. And so that's what the imagery that's being pointed up here. And so likewise, we're to do the same. But the picture continues in verse 2, and it says this. It says that we are to be looking to Jesus. So since we're surrounded by all these witnesses, as we run into the arena, as we finish our course here on earth, as we finish our life, we finish the race, we are to look up in the arena, see the clouds of witnesses, tier upon tier, cheering us on, but then also we're to shift our attention and look to Jesus. Look at Jesus. Here's what's cool about that. It is continuing with the imagery after we've arrived in the stadium, after we take a glance at these witnesses, we're called to just fix our eyes upon Jesus because he's the goal. He's the end result. He is what we're striving after. He's the finish line. And the end of verse 2, it describes this. It says that he is the founder. He's the perfecter of our faith. And he, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and he is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So this morning, as we begin to discuss the race that's set before us, I want us to just picture this as we pursue the imperishable. I want us to always remember that our end goal is always Jesus. It always has been, it always will be. Our finish line is him. He's the one waiting for us. He's the one we're seeking after. And our hope is to enter the arena of God's faithful witnesses, cheering us on as we look to Jesus, who's the founder and perfecter of our faith. Now, Since we have our eyes on this finish line, since we have our eyes on Jesus, since we know the goal, we know the reward, we know the end result of our race, let's take a few steps back. Join me in 1 Corinthians 9. And I'm just going to give you a brief overview of 1 Corinthians 9 before we get to the focal point of our passage. But Paul begins in 1 Corinthians 9, and he says this, he says, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the workmanship in the Lord? Are you not my workmanship?" And so Paul is speaking to a church at Corinth, and he's asking these 4 rhetorical questions, and they were meant to be answered with a resounding agreement. So Paul meant these rhetorical questions to be answered with them saying, yeah, we are. Yeah, you are. You are free. You are an apostle. We are your workmanship. And so the questions, the result of Paul telling the church not to use their rights to eat whatever as a stumbling block for others. Now, in backing up in chapter 8, verse 9, it says this, it says, "Take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak." The right he's referring to is that within the new covenant, children of God, you and I, Christians, we have the ability to basically eat what we desire. We can do things that those who were under the Old Testament law could not do. And that was brought to you by Jesus. Jesus was the fulfillment. He was a new law to us. And so we have new things we're allowed to do because of that. So Paul was speaking to this point, and he says, look, I don't want you to be misunderstood. We have freedoms. We have rights because of Jesus. But at the same time, he says not to use those as a stumbling block to your other brothers and sisters in Christ. He says don't use those to be a stumbling block to the weak. And so Paul opens chapter 9, and he asks these rhetorical questions. And I want you to get this, as he does that so he could prove his authority in his apostleship. And notice why. In verse 2, he says this. He says, "If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord." It's crazy to think. It's crazy to think that even Paul, who we look at as a pillar of Christianity, when you think of Paul, you immediately are just like, man, he was a giant of the faith. I mean, he did incredible things. But it's crazy to think that even he, as a pillar of Christianity, had people who called into question his ministry. There were people who sought to discount his authority and his apostleship. You know, he did countless things to further the kingdom of God. He went on multiple missionary journeys. He reached hundreds and thousands and millions of people for the cause of Christ, and even wrote around half of our New Testament. And yet people sought to discount his service to God. They sought to say, you're not really an apostle. You're not really chosen in serving God. You're just a normal person who's a false reference. You're a false preacher, a false teacher. People, despite Paul's accolades and all of the things he did, sought to distress all that. They sought to discount who he was. And I just want to stop there this morning and give a brief detour this morning. But it's important to know, church, that as leaders, with spiritual leaders, whether it's a pastor, whether it's a missionary, whatever the case, our leaders spiritually are always under attack. They are always threatened by people who are seeking to discredit their service to Christ and for others. But I want you to notice how Paul responded. Paul said, look, even if others seek to discredit me, if others seek to drag my name through the mud, I want you to know something, is that you are my seal. Isn't that awesome how Paul says, hey, you church, the ones who I'm speaking to, y'all are my seal. In other words, you are the proof. You are the evidence that I am truly a servant of God because you are my workmanship. You're part of what I've invested in. And so Paul says, look, even if no one else believes that I'm an apostle, he says, at least you do, because you are my workmanship. You are everything to me. He says, you are my legacy. You give me legitimacy. And therefore, since they were the seal of his ministry, Paul says in verse 3, he says this, this is my defense to those who would examine me. So Paul goes on defense here. Paul says, look, I'm thankful that y'all see me as an apostle, but there's certainly some that don't. Y'all are my seal, and here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a defense for my position. And so Paul gives us this defense, and he starts defending his right to eat or drink what he desires, and he also goes on and he defends his right to take along a believing wife. And notice the inclusion of the word believing. See, God desires you. It's his desire to take on a spouse that's going to be of one accord spiritually. God desires you to that. And here's the reason for that. The reason isn't because it's this exclusion process, but what is marriage? Marriage is the design of God of unity. And ultimately what marriage represents is his unity to us as the church. So if we're going to be a proper example of that, his desire is for us to be of one accord spiritually. So to properly put on display God's true design, he asks of us through Paul, it's this idea that we need to take along a believing spouse. And so there's some good truth to that. But Paul, he's defending that right. He's saying, look, can I not be married just like some of these other believers are, other apostles are? But Paul goes on and he gives a few other thoughts. He gives a few other rights and freedoms. And then we get all the way down to verse 19. Look at what he says in verse 19. He says, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. And there's a very important statement from Paul. So I just want to read that one more time. He says, for though I am free from all, he has rights in Christ. He's free. I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. See, the emphasis here, it's on Paul. I want to stop and just break this down for a moment. Paul begins by stating that he's free from all, yet ultimately and immediately after that, he offers up this contrasting statement. He says, despite me being free, even though I am free and I have this ability to do what I want in a way, he says, despite that, I have made myself a servant. And that word bondservant is what it means in the Greek. And the idea basically is you are like a paid laborer. He basically puts himself in bondage to this idea. So it's very cool what Paul's saying. He's saying, look, I know I'm free, but I basically made myself a slave to others. And we're going to get some example of how he does this and what that means. But I want us to focus on that second part of that phrase, is that Paul made himself. The emphasis is that Paul willingly, he made the choice to humble himself to others. And he goes on in verse 20 and he says this. He says, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. He says, to those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. So here's what's going on is in short, this may get lost because you're like, outside, under, what's all this law stuff? What he's talking about is this. He's saying, look, whether they were Jewish, whether they were under the Old Testament law, or whether they were under the New Covenant and outside the Old Testament law. He said, regardless of what they were, regardless of who Paul was around, he sought to assimilate or become like those who are around him. And by the way, I just have to make this claim is when Paul says this, here's what I mean, is that he wasn't doing this as a man who had an identity crisis. Paul wasn't that guy who runs around and joins every crew he can just for a few months and then switches. He wasn't that friend that you love but drives you nuts during whatever sports season because they're a complete and total bandwagon fan. You know, you have those friends who, I mean, it's just like, boom, they are bandwagon to the maximum. And you're just like, bro, you were just this fan like 2 weeks ago. Here's the thing, Paul is not that. And by the way, I've miscontextually identified this verse as the life verse of all bandwagon fans. Here's what I mean by that. There is shortly coming a time when Dak Prescott is going to lead the Cowboys to some golden glory. It's happening, Chris. And here's the deal. There are going to be those haters, Chris, who are going to jump on the Cowboys bandwagon. And it's going to happen. Hey, you're going to be mesmerized by this, man. And here's what's going to take place is those people, they're going to jump on this bandwagon. They're going to be like, man, I knew all along. Jerry knows what he's doing. That might be taken a little bit far. But here's the thing. It might not. But here's the cool thing is when you ask these people, like, why are you on our bandwagon now? They'll be like, I have become all things to all men. You know, that's the thing. All these new Golden State fans that were Heat fans a few years ago, they're just becoming all things to all men. I mean, that's what it is. But here's the thing. Regardless of that, Paul was not this. Paul was not the bandwagon fan that switched from allegiance to allegiance. Paul wasn't just trying to figure out, oh, well, I'm going to be with this crew now today, but I'm going to go to this. Paul did this on a case-by-case objective. It was a case-by-case basis, and he did this with absolute purpose. Paul had intent to this. It wasn't this idea that he had an identity crisis and couldn't figure out who he was or what he was. Paul sought after people, and he sought the best way that he could possibly identify them was to be like them. And here's what it means is it was in a religious sense. What Paul did was he made changes, and he would avoid stumbling blocks, just like we talked about in chapter 8 of each of these groups, for the purpose of winning and growing souls. some to Christ. Now he goes on in verse 22 and he says this. He says, to the weak I became weak that I might win the weak. And here again, he concludes this point towards the end of that verse. He says, I again have become all things to all people that by all means I might save some. Paul says, look, I'm going to do everything I can to assimilate myself into other cultures so that by chance I can even win some of them to Christ. And this idea of winning, it's not just about the idea of salvation, it's also sanctification. It's the idea of bringing them closer to God. So he says, look, I'm not going to worry about what I can religiously do or what I can't do. He said, it's not about the religion side of that. I'm going to push all that to the side. I just want to get to know them and I'm going to serve them and I'm going to be like them in whatever capacity just so I can bring them to Christ. A lot of submission taking place there. A lot of humility that goes on. And so we see that in verse 22. He says that, and then in verse 23, he opens up and he says, look, I do all this. This is his purpose. This is his reason. He says, I do all of this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Here's the thing. When you sow seeds of gospel, when you pour into people, when you challenge people, when you encourage people, when you help people change, here's what happens, is that you are sharing in the blessing with them. As their life changes, as their life transforms, it becomes like Christ. What's also happening is that God is blessing you for that same thing. It's incredible to see. And so that's what Paul said, look, I'm trying to just win some. I'll be anything I need to be so I can win some to Christ, because here's what I do know is I do know that I get to experience, I get to share with them in these incredible blessings. And that brings us to the focus of our text this morning. And I want to point out one thing really quick. All that we've already gone through may seem like a bunch of extra info just to get through these verses, but I promise you it's all about context this morning. We want to understand these verses in their original context, and all those verses before this, all this excess stuff that seems like it may be like, how's this go to our point? Here's the thing, all these are what gives purpose to the focal point of our text, and that's 1 Corinthians 9. We'll start in verse 24. So let's look there this morning if you have a Bible. 1 Corinthians 9:24. It says, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one runs to receive the prize? And he says, so run that you may obtain it. So already we're given this idea again of a race. And he says, look, just run that you may achieve this race. And we see again that Paul has shifted his attention back to this imagery. And so he says, look, all runners run, but only one receives the prize. So run that you may obtain it. And he says this, he says in verse 25, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. Now, it's important to understand when he says self-control in all things, what he's referring to is he's referring to this preparation for the challenge. Now, what would take place is there were 4 sacred games that would take place in the Greek culture for the ancient times. And these games, 2 of them that were the most famous were the Olympic Games and the Isthmian Games. So when Paul's talking about these events, these races, he's speaking of events like these, and he frequently references these ideas of these games. And so we see that in Hebrews 12. But he says that all these athletes, they seek to obtain this goal, and in preparation for that challenge, what they do is they exercise self-control. Now that word self-control doesn't just mean that they try to not do this or make sure that they do this. That word self-control literally means the idea of an athlete requiring strict training, of disciplining themselves to be ready for a specific race or a specific event. And they poured in the preparations. As the verse concludes, it says that it was to receive a perishable wreath. So they did all this, sometimes up to a year of training, all for something that would eventually perish. And this time the Olympic crown was made of leaves, while the Isthmian crown was often made of this pine or ivy. But notice, neither would last the test of time. Therefore, Paul, he brings our attention to this. He says, look, I want us to focus. And he says, I want us to get the bigger picture. He says, all this stuff is going to perish. All of it's going to falter. It doesn't matter what crown, what wreath it is. It's all going to come to an end at some point. And here's the thing. Let's just reorient ourselves for a minute. Let's focus on this for a second. If these athletes spent all of this time, if they poured into their preparation and they dedicated their lives to the pursuit of something perishable, how much more should we be preparing for the pursuit of something that's imperishable? Just think about that for a second. I hope that challenges you this morning, because the reality of it is we see the dedication that these athletes have. And if they're doing that for the pursuit of a momentary limelight and a momentary time of holding on to this precious metal, how much more should we pursue and prepare for the imperishable things, for God's rewards? And so, let's think about this for a moment. Athletes, they train years on end for temporary medals, for these false recognition, and yet seldom do we pour ourselves into preparation for the imperishable crowns of heaven. We don't practice often submission to the service of our King. We get busy and we do other things. And this is to me too. I do this all the time, where I push to the side my preparation for the kingdom. I push to the side disciplining myself for a perishable thing. Whatever the case be, Paul is pointing this out to us. There's an incredible conviction underlying these words from Paul, because Paul was saying this is, look, I'm only capable of becoming all things to all men. I can only do this, and I can only see some grow because of his constant diligence to train and discipline himself. The only reason Paul was successful in his ministry, the only reason he was able to become all things to all men, was because Paul was dedicated. He poured himself out into the preparation of fulfilling the gospel, of living it out and serving people. And so I want us to ask ourselves this question: am I diligently seeking to pour into the pursuit and preparation of the imperishable rewards? Am I seeking after the pursuit of God's rewards, or do I spend the majority of my time pursuing the rewards of the perishable? In other words, do I practice, do I diligently work on myself just for things that aren't going to matter outside of this world, or do I pour into things that God's going to reward? That's an important question to be asking. And Paul gives those who pursue and prepare the imperishable crown some awesome encouragement in verse 26. Check this out. He says, because that we are pursuing the imperishable, he says, I do not run aimlessly. I don't box as one beating the air. He says, but I discipline my body and I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. The implications of these verses are clear. Paul says, look, if we dedicate our lives to preparation, if we dedicate our lives to the pursuit of the imperishable rewards, we are destined to run for something much bigger than ourselves. But on the contrary, Paul says, look, if we dedicate our lives to the pursuit of perishable things, of rewards that don't last, he says, you're literally destining your life to run aimlessly. You're running a race with no finish line. You're running a race with no purpose. In fact, he says, look, you're basically never even stepping foot into the ring. He says it's just like you're shadow boxing the whole time. And so Paul gives us this idea, and he's saying, look, you who pursue perishable things, you're wasting your life, and you're never going to set foot in the ring. You're never going to set foot across the finish line. There's no point in what you're doing. Instead, Paul says, I discipline my body. I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So Paul did all this for two main reasons. This is the main points I want us to get this morning. Paul's motivation, as we talked about in the beginning, he had two main reasons he disciplined himself. One of the first reasons is that he did it to be greeted by the great clouds of witnesses in Christ himself that he mentions in Hebrews 12. Paul knew that his finish line was to be greeted by a cloud of those faithful and by Jesus Christ himself. That was his motivation. That was his finish line. He knew that he could pursue these things. He could become all things to all men because Jesus Christ was the one waiting to give him encouragement. Those whom came before him were waiting for him to give encouragement. And the second thing is this, as he did it so that he could say in 2 Timothy 4, verses 7 through 8, I have fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. And henceforth, there's laid up for me. So because I've fought the good fight, because I've kept the race of faith and I've done it diligently, he said, henceforth, because of that, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. That's the imperishable that we're talking about, the crown of righteousness. And he said, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but all those who loved his appearing. Paul says, look, my purpose for running is to be greeted by the great clouds of witnesses in Jesus Christ. But beyond that, my purpose of running is because I know the rewards that I'm pursuing are imperishable. I'm chasing after Jesus Christ laying and bestowing upon me something so much greater, and it's his righteousness. It's his goodness. It's his eternal nature. And what that means is that he gets to spend eternity with God in heaven. He gets to experience all that. So Paul was so excited about that. And so the question is where are you this morning? If we bring it back to ourselves, if we apply it to ourselves, where are you this morning? Are you running aimlessly, or are you busy shadow boxing and pursuing the perishable rewards? Are you diligently in the ring training? Are you pursuing the imperishable rewards of God? Because I promise you, only one of those is worth it. We've got to dedicate our lives to the pursuit of the imperishable things. dedicate our lives to service to God, discipline ourselves, humble ourselves. Because in context, what Paul was doing is Paul was saying, look, I count myself not above anybody else. I'm willing to humble myself. And even though I'm able to do things that I'm free in Christ, he said, despite that, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to humble myself and I'll be all things to all men. He said, it doesn't matter if I agree with them or not. I don't want to be a stumbling block to them. He was disciplined in his efforts to pursue other people, other creations of God. So I pray and I challenge you this morning, let's do the same thing. Let's jump in this race. Let's pursue the finish line, the clouds of witnesses. Let's pursue Jesus Christ. Let's seek the pursuit of the imperishable that God is going to reward to us on that day.